into AES67 over 1. And the first question, of course, being, why would I do that? Well, I think you all know the answer because you're there today. It's been a year now that we have this virus in the air and that we need to produce content from a distance. While most of this content production is file-based, there are still live contents that are being produced. And when trying to reach the highest quality, AES67 or ST2110 becomes a question. So basically the setup is as such. I have one studio on one location with computers and devices. I have another studio in another location with maybe two computers on one device, and I need to link them. And those are remote sites. So what lies in between is only a gray cloud full of programs, which is called the wide area network. And it can be, of course, of many different types. So you can lease one line, you can lease the network and maybe get closer to the performances that you would get on a local area network. You could use the internet and maybe connect to a data center, or you can even use VPN and make it so it seems that endpoint C is part of LAN A, although due to the VPN and the long distance, you will have problems trying to connect to this endpoint C. So this presentation today is coming from an ongoing work of the SCO2-12-M group of the Audio Engineering Society, which is the group dedicated to AES67 development. And of course, this work started in reason for this pandemic and all the questions arising between what can I do with my AES67 devices? Are they ready for one? What do I need to add to the network to do a proper connection? And what should I do as a manufacturer to improve my equipment to be able to do AES67 over 1? And this is still a work in progress, because this is a huge task in appreciating all the different subtleties of the subject. And the presentation today will only address some small problems and some small solutions, of course, but this work is progressing well, and I hope that we can release the paper later this year. So the first question is, Internet is IP, so is audio or video over IP? So the question is, isn't ST2110 one ready by design? Meaning that, okay, it's basically the same connector, RJ45 connector when I connect to a LAN or to a WAN, to my box at home with the internet. But of course, you have different properties on those networks. A local area network is small distances, private and controlled network. This means that you have full control on your network, on what goes on your network, on the security and the policies on your network, and very few restrictions on what you can do with this network. And AES67 and ST2110 was built with those line constraints in mind, or for such the lack of constraints. While on the WAN, you have long distances first. And we will see that this will significantly impact the capacity of different AES67 devices to be synchronized with one another. You have most likely a raised or even a public network between your remote sites, and those will provide limitations in terms of protocol you can use. So for instance, you mostly can forget about multicast. And also in terms of bandwidth. Of course, it's very hard to find an internet connection of 10 gigs, while it is possible, but you will most likely be limited to a couple hundreds of megabytes if you're lucky. So typically, this real-time audio is transported with ASIP, audio contribution over IP, which is based on the EBU Tech 3326. But this ASIP is mainly used on codecs with compressed audio, and while using AES67 on a network, you may want to have the properties of AES67 even on your wide area network. But the internet was not designed for that. And the internet was never built with the idea of real-time communication as a stream of real-time data. And latency is a feature of packet switch network. So you have to deal with that. But that's nothing new to us. We did deal with all the problems of the network when designing AES67, ST2110, and ST2110. But on a wide area network, they are on a different scale. While the problems are the same, the solution will be dramatically different. And let's first by talking about the quality of service of a wide area network. You have multiple ways of defining the wide area network. You can start by the internet, and the internet, of course, is the wide area network that we are all using right now to connect to Zoom and to assist to this wonderful presentation. But you also can borrow one and have a dedicated contract with a provider that will give you a SLA, a service level agreement, that will allow you to expect some performances on your wide area network. The bandwidth, the quality of service, even the latency or some redundancy. But if you are big broadcasters, like we have some in the working group in Canada, in Switzerland, or in France, you may even have your own one. And this is the dream, of course, because you can do whatever you want on this one or whatever you can. And you have a dedicated team to manage that. So from you are on your own using the internet to you have a full team using your own network across the whole country, all those are wide area networks. And more on that, when talking about a wide area network, you can also add the problematic of the cloud, which means you want to address the problem of I have devices that are virtual, that are in the cloud somewhere, and I want to connect to them. So here we're only talking about transport. So with that in mind, we acknowledge that talking about virtualization is basically talking about another type of one, because the virtualization is another layer of imprecision, of jitter in the packets. So let's not talk about the cloud anymore, because it's just like the one. So do I need ST2110? Do I need AES67? The short answer is no, you don't really need it. You need it only if you need precise timing and PCM quality and low latency. Otherwise, you may find easier protocols to deal with using the one. But of course, you may not choose simplicity because you have two different sites already using AES67 and you just want to link them without additional devices. So this is another way of using AES67. And for the other equipment, for the other cases, of course, you can look at ISIP, and there are mostly some other protocols. The problem associated with one. The first problem that you have when you're using a one is the delay. So here is a map of France, for instance, and you have some big network connections between cities. So if I want to go from Bordeaux to Lyon, for instance, I don't have a straight line. I need to go via Paris. So even though Bordeaux to Lyon is only 500 kilometers, my data will do 1,000 kilometers because of the topology of the network. And light does not travel instantaneously, and that means that for 1,000 kilometers you will have 5 milliseconds of travel time. So this is a problem. And the other problem is, of course, you will have to traverse different audio device, different network devices, managing the packets on their travel over the network. And this means that doing another experiment from Grenoble, where I live, to Lausanne, where the emerging technologies office are, they are only 200 kilometers. So you would expect, oh cool, I can do the communication within 1 millisecond. But not at all, because you're going through the internet, and here a simple ping means that the round trip time is at least 16 milliseconds on my connection, and at most 42 milliseconds. This means that I will need a huge buffer, at least 30 milliseconds, to be able to accommodate all the jitter and the imprecision on the travel time of those packets. So basically, whether in LAN you can neglect the geographic delay, and the packet delay variation is most likely within a 1 or 2 millisecond buffer. In the WAN, you will have a geographic delay that will not be compressible, or it will be if you invent a time travel machine. But right now you have to deal with this geographic delay, and you will have packet delay variation that basically depends on the quality of the network you're on. And those can be really huge. So huge that when doing some experiments, going back and forth from here Grenoble to Germany, I had to set my buffers to 16,000 samples, meaning 333 milliseconds. That in order to be able to receive the stream properly using the WAN. You will see more on that following the presentation from Bill today. Then, of course, when you did deal with the delay, with the proper buffer sizing, you have to deal with timing and synchronization. And AES67 is based on the PTP timescale, which means that you have to share the same timescale between all the sites that you want to connect using AES67. And you can do that by PTP, synced over GNSS, Global Navigational Satellite System. The drawback is that it's expensive, and it may even be impractical, because you have to have an antenna to receive the GNSS signal, and you do not have necessarily the capacity or the ability to properly position this antenna. You can do PTP over the WAN. It's imprecise, there are jitter and asymmetry, and I guess Daniel will talk about that in the next presentation. And of course, you have other means. The only goal is sharing the same time representation between all the sites. So you can use NTP, you can use other things. Basically, now is the time to be creative and to find a way of meeting the network, the timing requirements with all the problems of the wide area network. So the typical setup is this. I have one grandmaster on each site. They are all synchronized to the same GNSS. So here is GPS. And the grandmaster is distributing the time on each side. And those timing are very close to one another because they are synchronized to GPS. So it's generally below 100 nanoseconds of precision. So you will have, it will be very easy to share audio within those devices. But there is another big problem on the wide area network, and mainly on the internet, is that you will lose packets. You will lose packets. While on the local area network, you do not generally lose a packet, or if you do, you generally have a network congestion that you want to avoid. On a wide area network, you cannot really control those network congestion and leak failure, and you will lose packets on your stream. And sadly, AES67 does not provide any answer on this redundancy, but 2110 does. by using 2022-7, known as multipath redundancy. There are also other techniques, such as FEC, SRT, or RIST, that can be used. And basically, FEC is sending data along with the stream to be able to reconstruct missing or corrupted data. So implementation of FEC can be complicated. There are multiple ways of doing FEC, and it's only efficient in some very specific traffic shaping and error or packet missing structures. You can also use RIST and SRT. Here you do not have a proactive way of doing redundancy. You do it reactively, and the receiver, when detecting that it has a missing packet, will ask the sender to send the packet back. Here, the drawback is that you will have a much higher latency because you have to wait for a couple of times the round trip time. So taking back my example of Grenoble to Lausanne, you saw that my bigger round trip time was of 40 milliseconds. So if I wanted to go with this connection, I would have at least 120 milliseconds of latency just to make sure that I have enough time to recover my packets. But of course, if you can afford it, and afford it in terms of the available bandwidth and the fact of using different paths, that is not necessarily a given on the internet because you do not necessarily control those different paths. ST2022-7 is still a good solution. In terms of latency, the overall latency of the link will be only the latency of the slowest path, so it can be much lower than using RIST or FEC. And last but not least, of course, you have to deal with those IP, public IP, private IP, IPv6, etc. And the main problem is multicast. You need to take caution when doing multicast across subnets, and it's even forbidden on the internet and on many large systems, such as data centers. And then you have to punch holes through NATs, meaning that most likely all your audio devices will be hidden between one public IP, and to go from those public IP to those private IPs, you will have to go through a network address translation device, typically your internet provider box, for instance, and those are adding a layer of complexity. But of course, you could use IPv6, which is very efficient in addressing those public IPs limitation of IPv4. I'm using IPv6 often right now, but the problem is that, of course, the number of devices that are using IPv6 and AES67 at the same time are very sparse, if any. So the simplest solution is to use a gateway. And there are even some companies that are specialized in providing edge devices that will take the stream from one side and send it to the other side. I guess Claudio will present a system that is close to that. And basically, it's just a black box. You don't really care about what it's doing. But of course, what it's doing is all that we talked about before: redundancy, buffering, etc. So what performance can I expect? And what are the best practices? So first, I need to ask myself a couple of questions. What is the workflow? Can I compensate for latency? Meaning that, can I manage the latency? And if I have 1 second of latency, is it enough that I know 1 second of latency, or do I really need less than 1 second of latency? Do I need precise timing? Are the timestamp enough? Do I really need PTP, or do I just use the timestamp of the streams? And do I need to share everything from site A to B, or just single stream, or all the streams, or all the data? So let's address some typical use cases. For instance, you have one-way communication, studio to studio. you want to do broadcast or monitoring. So this is a typical program that does not require precise timing. You can even have an SRC. Generally, you do not do this using AES67, but you could, of course. This is typically a solution for a codec. Then you can do remote recording. So when you are doing remote recording, of course, you cannot use an SRC. You want the best quality, but you can compensate the delay. And this is what digital audio workstations are doing today, compensating the delay when recording through a sound card or different plugins. So it's just the same program, but with a different scale. You could do remote processing. So again, you don't have SRC, you even need precise timing. But if you're using mix minus and you're clever enough, you could have some resilience to latency. And you could have mixing with high latency without anyone knowing much about that. And of course, you have live performance. And when doing live performance, the closer the better, because latency is basically your enemy. Okay, and then the synchronization performance. So when using GPS, as I said before, your clock will be very tightly synced, most likely less than 100 milliseconds between them. When using PTP over a dedicated one that you can manage and where you can manage the quality of service, you will have a good performance, less than 10 microseconds, but PTP can also be used over VPN, and I did some experiments like that, and it was a total chaos. So when PTP cannot be recovered precisely from the network, you could use boundary clocks, and those are, of course, obvious solutions. So you have one clock on your network that is dedicated in reconstructing the clock so that you can distribute a clean PTP to the other devices on the network. And tunneling, as said before, it will be used to avoid NAT and multicast issues. You can basically use a tunnel to merge different LANs and to pass the data as if the devices were on the same LAN. This is the way I'm working right now for my own lab. So if you're interested in SRT and RIST, do not miss the presentation by Bill later, and we did one with the Ravenna consortium later last year. And of course, you have equipment compatibility. That is a problem, because all those solutions presented, they are not necessarily available right now. So for instance, I might have an equipment that cannot cope with high jitter and PTP, meaning that the high delay variation, the high packet delay variation of PTP might be an issue. And then, as I said before, I should use a boundary clock. If my equipment is not able to provide enough buffer size, because within AES67, the maximum buffer size is typically 20 milliseconds, and it's not enough to do with the one. So what could I do? Well, we had this problem at Emerging Technologies for some devices, and we have a customer that just asked us the question, and we provided him with some devices that were up to 400 milliseconds of buffer. And of course, you will have equipments that do not embed SRT or RIST. Once again, use a gateway. You can even have simple gateways just to do the SRT or the RIST embedding. And of course, when no precise synchronization is needed, some devices can just ignore the timestamps values and synchronize on the frequency only. This is very typical when doing wide area network, because you don't necessarily need interaction and precise timing. So the good thing is that AES67 is based on IT standards. RTP is widely used over the internet, and AES67 does not require any specific equipment, transport equipment. But WAN was not. So you see that this is a kind of a mixed problem. You can transport easily AES67 over the WAN, but to do it efficiently, you need to do it using unicast, because you will likely not have multicast available on your WAN. You may use a tunnel or global navigational satellite system so that you can reconstruct the proper clock. You will most likely need high buffers just because you have long distances between your sites and a high variation of those different packet delay. And of course, it all comes down to workflow analysis. Analyze what you need and what are the features that you are already mandatory needing to work and to be able to reach your goals, and just forget about those features that you don't really need to be able to do it properly on the WAN. Okay, so that's it for my presentation.